Okay, it's 12:01, and I'm going to go ahead and get us started. My name is Eli Sagor. I am with the University of Minnesota Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative based at the Cloquet Forestry Center. Really glad to be here today. We are joined by Brian Palik. Brian is with the Northern Research Station of the U.S. Forest Service. He is well known to many of you, no doubt, in our audience, and he's going to be talking today about research that he's been involved in for several years now, about transitioning black ash wetlands to an EAB-infested future. Today's talk will last about an hour. We usually run until 1 o'clock Central Time, give or take a little bit. And I will invite you, as we go through the presentation, to submit questions at any time. Please submit those using the Q&A link. We may not see them because of some quirks with the broadcast software if you use the chat window. So please be sure to use the Q&A window and submit those questions anytime. Those of you who are here in St. Paul, when I pause for questions, if you have one, just raise your hand and I'll pass that along to Brian. This presentation comes to you from SFEC and the University of Minnesota Extension forestry team, and we're happy to be here. I think those are all the preliminaries that I've got, so I think I'm going to hand the floor to Brian. I'm going to mute my machine here, and Brian, you're on.
Okay, thanks, Eli. So as Eli said, I'm going to be talking about a large project we've had ongoing for a number of years, looking at transitioning black ash wetlands to what we think is the future down the road with EAB moving into the area. I want to acknowledge that I'm giving this talk, but I really work closely in this project with Tony D'Amato, who many of you know, and he's now at the University of Vermont, but continues to work with us on this, and then Rob Slezak at the Forest Resource Council. So just a brief outline, I'll talk about context, why we're concerned, and then what the concern is. It's EAB, but it's broader than that. We'll talk about that, and then focus on the need for adaptive strategies on the ground for moving these wetlands to the future. So a little bit on context. We know that this species is important in the Lake States and in Minnesota specifically, and you get a sense for that here looking at this FIA map. More green means more of this species and forest type in the region. You can see there's more of it in the up northern Lake States than anywhere else in the eastern U.S. or in the U.S. So large proportion of the land base here in Minnesota, over 1 million acres and over 1 billion trees. And then of course we find these forests in these areas with impeded drainage of various types. So why do we care? Why are black ash forests important? There is a timber resource associated with this species and forest type, and not all of these trees are going to look like this one on the left. This is a pretty high quality veneer tree. Most of them look more like this one in the middle, depending on where you're at. But even there, those trees are used for pallets and crates and firewood. So there is a resource associated with it. It's an important habitat as well, because you think about where we're at. We're in the land of conifer-dominated wetlands. So this is a deciduous hardwood species in a wetland setting, so a different habitat type. Because they're wetlands, decomposition in the soil is slower, so there's garbage storage issues associated with this forest type. And then importantly is the cultural resource aspect of it. And probably most of you know that black ash produces, it's the only source of splints for Native American basket making from here to Maine. So it's really important from that standpoint. Focusing more on Minnesota, why we're unique here, why this resource is unique here, is because in our northern forests, the single species is oftentimes the dominant tree species in those wetland ecosystems. And this just shows a graphic looking at density of different tree species from a broad survey of sites across the north that Mike Ostry and Rob Bennett and I did a few years ago. And you can see from this that black ash, one species, is overwhelmingly the dominant. So that kind of low abundance of other species will be important as we talk further here. Some of the other things we know about this forest type in terms of age structure and disturbance history This is a graphic that shows establishment history by decade in an old growth stand, northern Minnesota. This is work that Tony D'Amato led, and it's one example of several old growth stands that were looked at. And the kind of take-home messages here is one, black ash is a really long-lived tree species, and it can live over 300 years, and you see that with some individuals here. These forests tend to be strongly uneven age, with recruitment peaks reflective of, like here and here, of past droughts and a canopy disturbance. But there's overstory present during regeneration events. So it's indicative of gap-based dynamics, much like our northern hardwood forests in the lake states. So working in similar ways. That dynamic will be important to think about and keep in mind when we come back to management strategies. So what do we know? Well, we know this species and forest type has issues, and that's predominantly right now emerald ash borer that we're thinking about. This just shows the distribution for EAB by county detection. Of course, it's all over the eastern U.S. now, but just starting to come into this area of the country that has the largest concentration of ash, and black ash in this case, in North America. So the insect's going to be faced with a different environment than it's seen to date. And of course, in that first wave of it coming through, we know that it's very high mortality of trees, over about 1 inch in diameter. So it's a real concern. So there's EAB, but then we also talk about that there's even more bad news facing this forest type, and it has to do with the climate projections for northern Minnesota. So most of you have seen this graphic. By the end of the century, under high emission scenarios, the projection is summers like Kansas in Minnesota and winters like northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin. So that's bad because EAB is cold sensitive. And the work that Rob Vanette and collaborators have been doing is looking at that. So with warmer winters projected, it's most likely going to lead to higher EAB survival. So this cold cold temperature restriction that the insect may be faced with now in the extreme north may become less so in the future. So there's another aspect to climate change that's a concern for EAB, and it has to do with the projected habitat changes for co-occurring tree species in these wetlands. So the species that I showed you earlier that co-occur in small abundance in those wetlands, Tree Atlas modeling predicts reduced habitat suitability for at least half of them, and maybe neutral to increased habitat suitability for a quarter of each of those. But the problem with even that, the neutral or increased habitat suitability, you go back to this graphic, is that those species occur in really low abundance, mostly on average in this forest type. So there's few future adaptive species currently that occur in any abundance in this forest. And the aspect of that news is even a little bit worse when you start looking at regeneration potential of other species in these wetlands in the north. So this shows density of sapling-sized trees in black ash wetlands, and it's by species. Again, this was work, different paper, but work that Mike and Rob and I pursued. And the point here is that other than black ash, there's hardly any trees. It's mostly speckled alder, so a shrub. And then I don't show these data, but you can drill down to the smaller regeneration layer, and the story's the same, or even worse. It's just shrub species on average. I'm not saying there isn't trees regenerating these wetlands somewhere, but in our broad survey of, I don't remember, 70 or so stands, it wasn't the case. So the problem is that there's no tree species poised to replace black ash should something bad happen, like we anticipate that it's going to happen with EAB moving west and north. So then the concern is this, that without trees, black ash wetlands get even wetter. So they start out wet, they get wetter. Sedges and shrubs can come to dominate, at least early on in succession, and tree establishment becomes pretty difficult. And then there may be this associated loss of ecosystem function and unique habitat. And let's just take a second here. I'm not going to talk in great detail about this, but a little bit on the cascading effects of loss of ash for ecosystem function. So we've been looking at this as kind of another aspect of our work, and this was a graphic that comes out of a recent wetlands review paper that Melissa Youngquist, the postdoc that works with us on our projects, put together. And you know, I'm not going to go into detail of this. You can look at it at your leisure. But what it suggests is, with the loss of a foundational species, black ash in this case, due to EAB, there may be this whole integrated interacting cascade effect of changes in litter quality and canopy cover and resource availability affecting decomposition and aquatic food webs and ultimately things like amphibians. So I'll give you a little bit of results from her work later, but it's more than just loss of habitat, loss of the tree species. There could be a lot more going on. So essentially, there's this growing sense of urgency among many of the regional organizations and agencies to find adaptation strategies to maintain these trees in these ecosystems. So the need is strategies that keep forests on the landscape. And in reality, they may not look like this forest, this ash forest in this picture here, but the point is there's a need to keep trees in some capacity for the various functions they perform in these wetlands. So Eli, just quick break here. That's kind of context in the concern. If there's questions you think I should address now, I can do that at this point.
Oh, I guess I thought I was muted. I don't see any questions that have come in yet, Brian. So okay. I did just suggest to folks through the chat pod that they submit them.
Okay.
But I don't see any yet. So just a reminder while I've got the floor, if anyone has questions online, please use the Q&A pod and we will address those. Anyone in the room, any questions for Brian from folks here in St. Paul? Yes?
About I'm curious about the difference in ET or the hydrology really of how the black ash overstory functions compared to what you would anticipate the say speckled alder, if that came to dominate somehow. What would be the magnitude, I guess, of the difference in terms of ET and the hydrology of the system with that change in color?
Brian, I'm guessing you may not have been able to hear that. Could you hear that question?
Not really, no.
Okay. Question was, what would you expect for a change in evapotranspiration and the general hydrology of black ash stands if ash were to transition, if we were to transition from ash dominance to something like speckled alder? Did I get that right? There we go.
Yeah, okay. So I can say just a little bit on this, and that's that ET to some extent is really driven by leaf area and how much there is and how quickly it recovers after loss. So, whether it's alder or whether it's, we'll talk about this in a minute, lake sedge or some species from the south or black ash, it's really dependent on how quickly leaf area can be brought back up to the level that it was, like in this forest in the graphic here, this older forest. So, there's that. We know that if we can get leaf area back, we can do that. But then there's also the phenology of ET as well. And as you know, black ash first to lose its leaves, last to leaf out. So different species will behave differently that way. And I don't know. So Eli, that's about the extent of my knowledge on it. I don't know if Rob's in the room or not by chance, but he certainly is working on that and can maybe address that question with the asker, if that's possible.
Great. Rob is not in the room right now, but he's across the hall. We may be able to go grab him.
Okay.
We do have a few other questions here, Brian, through the Q&A pod. So thanks, folks, for submitting those. I think maybe I'll throw two of these, both of them at you at the same time, Brian. First is, what about the ability for tamaracks to grow where black ash do? So tamaracks as a potential replacement species. And then another one, second question here that's related. I see a problem to use fir as a replacement species for the change of litter and basically pH for the systems, even though fir is very available on many black ash stands on the Superior, especially the Ely area. So any thoughts on tamarack and balsam fir as potential replacements?
Yes, and my thought is, can we wait? Because I'm going to address that specifically as we get into some results on our replacement species.
Great.
Yes, I agree. thinking about what those species are ecologically, functionally is important. And I'll talk about that in a minute.
All right, thanks, Brian. That's all the questions for now.
Okay, so I'll go on. So that concern that I talked about led Tony and Rob and I, in particular, working with the Chippewa National Forest, to embark on this pretty large-scale manipulative experiment. And it is evaluating the ecological impacts of emerald ash borer in these forests. And this is work that's been funded through the LCCMR generously over a couple of cycles. And broadly, the questions are this: what are the potential impacts of EAB and associated management on structure and function of the forest? And then are there adaptive strategies to build site-level resilience to EAB and climate change in a way that maintains a forested wetland condition? So, just trying to change the slides. There we go. The study, some of you probably have seen this. It really was conceived by Gary Swanson, who's the silviculturist on the Chippewa National Forest, a number of years ago, and then developed into what it is now by myself and Tony and Rob. The project involves a significant amount of harvesting, and it was done in winter of 11-12, and then the plantings that we'll talk about here in a minute were in the following spring, fall. And we'll look at these visually in here in a minute, but the treatments are an unharvested control, so do nothing, see what happens. Clear cutting, group selection, and then what we call EAB emulation. And these treatments were all about 4 acres in size, so not huge, but large enough that we felt like we could talk about stand level impacts. And then it's pretty high replication for a silvicultural study like this. And the replicates are roughly half in WFN 55 and then the other half in WFN 64. And let me switch slides. There we go. So we're looking at a bunch of things here, and I'm just going to touch on a few of these here in a few minutes, but you can get a list of, you can see here a list of all the aspects of the ecosystems we're looking at and the cooperators that are working with us and have been working with us to examine this. So what do the treatments look like? A number of you have probably been to this on a demonstration or tour. This is where we tend to park, and then we walk around this area. So this is on the Chippewa National Forest. There's what the control forest looked like. And this area was picked to work in because there really isn't much evidence of decline/dieback that's been this ongoing phenomenon in the forest type for the last 20 years. They're in pretty good shape, as you can see from that. And then the clear cut treatment was, pretty extensive one, down to everything commercially harvestable. Probably it was 4 inches, it might have been 3, and then anything else was knocked over. But most of the ash were large enough to be commercially valuable. And there's the group selection. And what this amounts to are 5th acre openings, totaling about between 20 and 25% of the area of this 4 acre circle patch that we're calling a stand there. And then here's the girdling, the EAB emulation, which was done with girdling. And this photo is actually a few years old, so all these trees are dead now on the landscape. And the emulation was done through girdling. You can see a girdled tree, freshly girdled up in the upper left there. Somewhere between 12,000 and 15,000 trees were girdled. And they started a mortality kind of spiral downward that took about 3 or 4 years for the trees to die. So pretty similar to how EAB operates when it also girdles trees. So that was the idea here, was to create these big patches of dead ash on the landscape, and we were pretty successful at that. Another follow-up activity in both the clear cut and girdling treatments, if you see sprout back from the stump, the species sprouts, and also water sprouts this is a girdle tree on the right. And what we do in terms of follow-up has been when those stems get to be about 1 inch or so in diameter, to cut them down again. I think that's happened twice. Once on the stump sprouts, and then I think a couple times on these girdle trees, which just doesn't show them being cut, but we cut those off. below the girdle. And the idea is, although we don't know exactly how kind of the second wave of EAB might progress through a stand, the thought is that they'd be hanging around and kill those trees when they got large enough. So we're trying to emulate that. So then a big part of this, in addition to those silvicultural approaches, is looking at replacement tree species. And we settled on 12 trees, 12 species, and these were planted both in the fall and or in the spring to try to tease out differences in success based on planting season. And most of these species, which are listed there, are present in that regional black ash ecosystem, including, let's see, we have, I'm trying to remember the two species that were being asked about here. One was tamarack, which is up here, eastern larch. And then I thought we had planted balsam fir, but maybe not. And I think that was the other question species. And then there's a couple of these species that we planted from the next southern climate zone, hackberry and swamp white oak. And then there's one exotic. It's Manchurian ash, which is closely related to our native black ash. Manchurian is from Northeast Asia and Japan. It's EAB resistant. So the thought there was to, not only from a kind of functional ecological standpoint, but from a cultural standpoint, as potentially a substitute or replacement for Native American basket making material. And the species in red are all what we call future adaptive, both in terms of climate change, as well as obviously EAB, because they're not host species for EAB right now. So what I'm going to do now, Eli, is start going through some of the major results from this. But again, I thought if there's questions right now relative to the study design, that we could address that.
Okay, great. Thanks, Brian. There is one more question. Has anyone done any underplanting in black ash stands with success? And I think that's what you're about to tell us about with your research. So maybe this is another one to defer. But, and this one came in actually just right at the tail end, I guess, of our last pause. So I think we'll defer that. Here's another one. Has anyone done strip harvest studies? Maybe you want to talk about that?
Well, probably getting some feedback there. I don't know. You hear me okay?
Yes, you sound good to us.
Okay, it's feedback here. But so I'm not, I can't point to any particular ownership or agency that might be doing strip cutting, but I wouldn't be surprised. I think the whole, you'll see, I think that the need in terms of not disrupting the hydrology too much is to maintain some percentage of overstory adult trees when you're regenerating. And so we're taking a group approach, but I wouldn't be surprised if somebody wasn't looking at strip cutting as well. Yeah, and the earlier question about underplanting, we'll look at that here with our results, and I know others are doing that as well, like the Fond du Lac forestry folks have been doing that. So I think there is potential for that.
Great. Any other questions from here in St. Paul? Not seeing any others online, so why don't you proceed?
Okay, so I'm going to go into some results. And a key result here, and this is work that Rob heads up along with a graduate student and his advisor, Jake Diamond and Dan McLaughlin at Virginia Tech. If any of you were at the EAB conference in Duluth this summer, you heard Jake speak on this. So the hydrologic response is key to understanding what's going on with trees and other aspects of the ecosystem. And what this is showing here, all 5 of these are showing the same thing, just across time, a series of years. And it's looking at treatment water table depth relative to the control water table depth. So control is on the x-axis, and then the three treatments are on the y. And you can see the treatments, clear cut and girdle group, are color coded. This gray, I believe it's gray, 1-to-1 line is the pre-treatment relationship of the control. And then, so the idea here is just to look at how the treatments deviate from that 1-to-1 line within a year. It's just averaged, and it's by depth. So there's a bigger deviation deeper in the soil, but still some deviation as you get closer to the surface. And kind of the take-home messages here are that the girdle and clear-cut treatment, those two there, have a shallower depth water table. And I'm not showing this within a growing season. I had that graph, and we published on that, and this paper has the annual across growing season responses. They tend to wet up earlier in the spring, stay wetter, and then get wetter earlier in the fall than either the control forest or the group. And so then the other take home is that the group selection down here tracks that uncut and pre-harvest forest pretty well for the most part. Sometimes it's actually a little bit drier than the control. So the point here is that particularly in the clear cut and the girdle, think EAB coming in, killing trees after 3 or 4 years, potentially are quite challenging for regeneration because of that wetting up. Okay, so another challenging aspect of what happens relative to what trees are going to face has to do with the herbaceous ground layer response in these forests. And this is showing the clear-cut treatment in particular, which is the one that responded the fastest because the trees were gone right away. It's that lack of ET that we were talking about earlier. Because they wet up, there's an increase in this herbaceous cover that responds favorably to that. So sedges, grasses, cattails in particular. And Chris Looney, PhD student recently finished up at the U, has published on that. So again, it's a challenging environment for tree regeneration. It gets wetter and it gets pretty competitive in the openings here created by that loss of that overstory tree. Okay, so now what I want to do is kind of focus on results of the planted seedlings, given that background on hydrology and herbaceous competitors. And what this is showing is seedling survival after 5 years, and it's the 12 species that we planted, and they're ranked from highest survival after 5 years, and it's pretty much the same ranking now, in fact, and then last year, and then we're looking at this year right now, with American elm, and this is Dutch elm disease tolerant cultivar of American elm, down to swamp white oak, Manchurian ash, hackberry. And then you notice those species are all, I circled them because they're 40% survival or above. Then there's this group that go down from there that are all under 20% there. And kind of take home messages of this. This is just pooling across treatments and planting season, that survival is highest for non-native, Manchurian ash, pathologically limited, American elm. It's tolerant, but it's not resistant. Or these outer-range species, swamp white oak, hackberry. I know there's actually a hackberry on Otter Tail Peninsula in Leech Lake, but it's probably a disjunct population. Most of it's to the south, as you know, and then swamp white oak is as well. And then also these species with high survival are predicted with tree atlas modeling to be climate change adapted, future climate change adapted. And then survival is the lowest with these commonly occurring native species that are found in low abundance in this ecosystem. And they also happen to be species that Tree Atlas predicts to be maladapted to climate at the end of this century. So that's kind of broadening, just pooling across treatments. And then, of course, we look at this treatment response of survival by species as well, and that's what's shown here. And I don't, there's a lot of dots and dashes here, but the point is just to kind of look at this pattern. It's species on the y-axis, mean percent survival within the treatment on the x-axis. So you can see the pattern increases from really poor survival to, more survival as you get closer to the top. So the survival of these future adapted species that I talked about just in the last slide, swamp white oak, American elm, Manchurian ash, and hackberry, are generally lowest in the clear cut. They're still the highest of the group in the clear cut for the most part, but they're lower than they are in the other 3 treatments. And then there's similar patterns of survival among those species and really all species in these other 3 treatments, including the control, which is underplanting in the intact forest. So that's survival. It's not that lower light or whatever it is in the control isn't affecting survival per se, at least through year 5. So another way to look at survival is species by planting season. And I put this in here because, people are going to start thinking about outplanting, underplanting, or planting in groups or whatever of new species, this planting season is an issue because of the difficulty sometimes of planting in the spring, the normal planting season. So we want to look at fall planting survival as well, and that's what's shown here. So the species on the y-axis, survival on the x-axis. And kind of take home here is that there's higher fall survival for a couple of these species, swamp white oak, Manchurian ash, and balsam poplar down here. Higher spring survival, but the spring is the open triangles, of red maple and black spruce. But generally, there's not a huge difference in survival with planting season. And one of the reasons for that is that our spring planting was actually done, well, we avoided overly wet microsites in that spring planting and kind of planted on hummocks as opposed to hollows. And so, we'll talk about this more at the end, but I think this is good news in that it opens up some options in terms of potentially looking at fall planting for these types of forests. Of course, we're also looking at growth. Survival of these planted seedlings is just half the story. Growth is important as well, particularly as they get older and start to be impacted by competition. So this is growth between 2013 and 2015. Salini published this paper recently. And I'll point out that it's height growth on this graph, diameter on this graph by treatment, so just pooling across species. And this is actually relative growth rate. You can't compare growth of apples and oranges, white cedar to red maple, for example, directly, because the differences in starting size, morphology, planting stock. So they're relativized based on the initial size of it. And the point here is that, not surprisingly, both height and diameter growth increase from the control, the lower light treatment, to the group, to the girdle, to the clear cut. And I don't show this here, but light resources increase in parallel with this. It's not surprising. So it's a higher light resource environment here. We also, of course, look at growth by treatment and species interaction, and this is kind of set up like that previous graph. So this is species on the x-axis, and then this is just diameter growth by species here, or by treatment here. And you see pretty low growth overall in control, and then higher growth for some species in these other treatments. So most species had the highest growth in the clear cut and the girdle treatments, highest light, with group selection being kind of intermediate for most species, and then control the lowest. So if you think about some possible replacement species growth, something to look for on this when you get a chance to study it in more detail would be that balsam poplar has the highest growth in all treatments. And it doesn't matter, even in the control, it's the highest growth, diameter growth, and was height growth as well of all treatments. Swamp white oak and American elm, a couple of species with really high survival, had kind of moderate growth in all the treatments, so somewhere in the middle in each of them. And then Manchurian ash and hackberry was pretty low in all the treatments, not just in the control, but all of them. We'll get back to kind of ranking potential species replacements in just a minute here at the end, but what I want to do, because this is kind of brand new stuff, is just mention a little bit more on ecosystem function impacts of that species change. Because, somebody in the audience asked the question or posed the question about how these different species might affect pH and chemistry and so on, and we are looking at that. And this is, again, Melissa Youngquist's work, and she's working closely with, also, in addition to the three of us, also Sue Eggert, who's here in our lab, aquatic ecologist. And so, for example, what this focuses on is on leaf litter in the study sites that we've just been talking about. So this one is showing carbon-nitrogen ratios of 3 species. To extent, it's kind of fuzzy on my screen, but it's black ash, lake sedge, or I guess hairy sedge might be actually what it's called, and then swamp white oak. So thinking about what might replace black ash, either because we want it to, swamp white oak, or if we don't want it to, it just proliferates in terms of sedge. And what this graph shows is just carbon-nitrogen ratios of leaf litter over time. And the take-home here is that black ash has much higher quality litter compared to sedge and swamp white oak. So in terms of that nutrient relationship in that litter, that species change could matter. It translates into different rates of decomposition, which is shown on the right here. And the lower the bar goes, the faster the more decomposed that litter is in leaf packs out in the wetland. And the take home here is that black ash litter decomposes much faster than both sedge and swamp white oak. And the different colors, the open or closed, just has to do whether it's in a clear cut or control, which treatment it's in. But overall, black ash decomposes faster, so it presents higher quality processed litter faster to invertebrates than these other species. And then one last thing on this function, using kind of a feeding assay in a growth chamber using caddisflies, Melissa and Sue looked at survival probability of caddisflies on this different litter type, and we actually expanded the species involved to include speckled alder, somebody mentioned that, and elm and balsam poplar and lake sedge. And again, this is how many are alive over time, and they die out pretty quickly, so it's not a real long time frame. But the point here is that the best survival is on black ash and speckled alder and swamp white oak, but especially black ash. Survival is highest there, black ash, and it's lowest on things like balsam poplar, sedge, and American elm. The point here is that there's going to be a cascading effect of potential species changes with loss of black ash to EAB, whether it's replaced through management or not. That's going to affect more than just things like hydrology. It can translate through the entire food web. Okay, so going back to thinking about replacement species then, and what we're kind of suggesting is coming out of our work is that there's a need to balance both survival and growth, as we've been talking about. And that translates also into considering a shorter and longer term perspective for replacement. And that there's other factors about ecosystem responses that might need to be considered, like, for example, effects of those different species, litter quality on food webs. And we also think we need to consider the best silvicultural approach to facilitate survival and growth of those species. When we put all those three things together, we really focus on group selection in our treatment scenario as being consistent with the ecology of the ecosystem. Remember, these forests look to be driven by gap dynamics, much like upland northern hardwoods, so the group selection approach is consistent with that. We know that group selection minimizes the water table increase and limits that herbaceous increase that we talked about. And then generally, regeneration survival, this planted stuff, we are looking at natural regen, but the focus of thinking about replacement is really on planting. It's generally good survival than in the group than the other treatments, and growth is moderate, at least compared to clear cut and girdle, better than underplanting, but not quite as good as the clear cut and girdle. But again, you've got to integrate both survival and growth when you're thinking about this. So if you do that, here's a ranking of replacement species that we planted based on survival in the group selection. Again, American elm highest, swamp white oak, Manchurian ash, hackberry, and on down the line. So you can see where tamarack falls out in this. It's kind of poor survival for us in this study after the time frame that we've had. Then this is ranking the same species based on the 3 years of diameter growth, the data we looked at earlier, again, in the group selection. And the ranking is a bit different. You can see balsam poplar, again, comes out at the top. Tamarack is second in terms of growth, but survival is pretty poor. So in the short term, in terms of thinking about potential replacement species that are easy to get into that ecosystem and have pretty decent survival, particularly because sometimes it's in there already and they're just stump sprouting, so you get them back that way, but this is survival of our planted stuff. We suggest that balsam poplar might be something to be looking at. But if you want to take a longer term perspective, factoring in the climate change predictions that are likely to affect these species, including balsam poplar, and we're really thinking about suggested swamp white oak might be a longer term species to be thinking about. Really good survival to this point, and moderately to better than average growth. Now, we can compare that kind of ranking that we just looked at there to one that you can find in this guide. This is the management guideline that the University of Minnesota Extension Service put out a number of years ago. And they have a recommended replacement species order for these northern forests, and they have tamarack at the top in this. And recognize that this was the first shot at this, and our research and others was really meant to help refine this over time of what the ranking of these species should be. So tamarack, we're not seeing it really doing all that well in our systems, and in talking with people about this, it's probably not the most site appropriate location for tamarack in the kind of depressional wetlands we're working in. They suggested American elm being high up on the ranking list, and I think our results are consistent with that as long as it's DED tolerant. Balsam poplar, kind of mid for them, but again, in the shorter term was suggesting it might bump up even higher. And I probably wouldn't even have this on the list as a recommended replacement species, given what we might face with EAB. I'm not sure that, I think it's pretty low on the list, if perhaps not even there. So the point here is that replacement should consider things like site appropriateness, EAB resistance, and we're suggesting, which this didn't factor into it, understandably, is future climate adaptation, in which case, swamp white oak wasn't on their list because it's not in northern Minnesota, but it's looking pretty good in terms of how it performs. I'll just mention here quickly some ongoing and related efforts. So we call this phase 1 of this study that I've been talking about, the work on the Chippewa, and it involves all these parts, that some of which have been added more recently, like small mammals and birds, with Alexis Grandet at NRRI. And then we've expanded to what we call phase 2, which is looking at a range of sites across northern Minnesota to look at specifically natural regeneration, what's the potential replacement, if any, for black ash, the hydrology, the amphibians, small mammals, and birds. And both of these phases have been funded by the LCCMR over time and are, as I said, ongoing. So just to kind of summarize and conclude, adaptation strategies for these ash wetlands need to consider replacement species, not just what you do in terms of cutting the ash out, but what do you replace it with, but also the silvicultural approaches that are best suited to facilitate success. And then loss of species from EAB or preemptive clearcutting, which has been suggested in anticipation of EAB, while it does appear to increase growth of some of the species, does also shift sites towards challenging hydrologic conditions and may limit the long-term survival of those species. Group selection in our studies is consistent with the ecology of these systems, gap dynamics, uneven age, and it's generally good seedling survival, including several of those species that are future adapted. And I would just also say that it probably doesn't have to be group selection. There's probably other approaches that leave partial overstories in that forest that are going to serve kind of similar function in terms of maintaining hydrology. Balsam poplar, swamp white oak provide a good balance of growth and survival, particularly again with group selection. And then, as I pointed out, fall planting might be certainly logistically easier in terms of the sites being drier generally, and it oftentimes has higher survival for some species or about the same for most. So it might be an option that people should think about. And then going back to this question that was posed by the audience, preemptive planting in mature forests before EAB, particularly of tolerant species that are adapted to the setting, appears to be a viable strategy. I think you're going to have to open up that stand at some point to get more light in there, but in terms of survival in the short term, it looks to be a viable way to proceed. So Eli, that was what I had. I'm certainly happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you, Brian. We have a number of questions. I am going to go ahead and hit submit here. Before I forward those questions to you, I had a comment that I'm passing along from Kyle Gill up at the Cloquet Forestry Center, replying to the question about strip cutting. Kyle reminded us that the Wisconsin DNR Silvicultural Trials website has some studies about strip cutting and ash stands. I included a link in the chat pod. So those of you online can look for it there, and we'll be sending that out. We'll include that in the follow-up email. Anyone who's not online can drop me a line. I'd be happy to share that as well. But you can find it on Google too. It's just Wisconsin DNR Silviculture Trials. So number of questions. And some of these I'm just going to throw out in case people want to put things into the chat pod, because it's a little bit, some of these are better suited maybe for each other than for Brian. There were a few questions about, gee, where can we get this or that species? Where do you get planting stock of swamp white oak? Where can you get resistant American elms? What nurseries or suppliers sell the disease-resistant American elm? So I'm just going to throw those out. Brian, of course, if you want to reply to any of those, you can, but I'm guessing that the other members of the community kind of may have other thoughts on that too. So if you do, put them in the chat pod, and I will be sure to include those in our follow-up email.
Yeah, and so Eli, I should have looked this up, and I don't remember the sources for all of the stuff we planted. But the American elm, for example, came from the Chippewa National Forest. They've been planting it. It's a cross between what appeared to be a pretty tolerant tree there, and then I'm blanking on the cultivar that it's crossed with, but it's done out of the Delaware, Ohio Northern Research Station group down there that's been working with it. So we got that from them. The Manchurian ash was a struggle. We actually got it from a nursery. It's planted fairly frequently as kind of a landscape ornamental tree, although it's not the most beautiful looking thing in the world. But that's where that came from. And I wish I could remember where the swamp white oak came from, because, others are looking at planting that. I know the Wisconsin DNR, or on state lands in Wisconsin, they're planting it, and others are talking about, maybe some people have progressed here in Minnesota, they're doing it. But I can track that down and get that info to you.
Okay, thanks, Brian. If there's anything you'd like us to send out to folks, if you just send that to me, we'd be happy to include it. A comment from up the North Shore. Group selection is what we've done on the Cowish Ranger District, Superior National Forest. We've not gone above 20 to 25% in site treatments. Did the studies follow this percent treated of stands, or what was your percentage harvest area, Brian, for the group selection?
It was just about 25%, maybe just a little bit less of that. And it's always a good question. The follow-up question is how high can you go and not get that hydrologic increase? And we didn't look at that. And again, if somebody there is interested, they can walk across and ask Rob Slezak what he thinks. But in terms of that percentage, so we were at about the same percent.
Great, thank you. A couple of people asked about silver maple. I've heard you answer this one before, Brian, but little was said about silver maple. Where does this species rank? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, so if you saw the Minnesota extension document, it was on their potential ranking. I think it was lower on their list. We all kind of kick ourselves for not putting that in, but it really came down to that group of people, and we sort of all put in our top 12, and silver maple didn't come out within our ranking. So it wasn't any particular reason that we didn't do it, and probably in hindsight we should have. I think it's probably a viable thing to be looking at in those systems.
I'm going to mention this before I forget. As an educator, I always enjoy your remarks about the ash management guide. It's interesting. That research was done about 10 years ago, I think, 8 or 9 years ago. And that was people's perception. So that was a study in which they asked a bunch of people, resource managers for the most part from around northern Minnesota, what do you think would be the most likely trees to perform well? And there was some overlap. And the list that Brian presented reflects what people thought would be most likely to perform well in ash stands. This was before we had any of the results, or certainly the resolution and quality of data that Brian has just reported on. So it's interesting to see where people's thoughts and guesses line up and are correct, essentially, or at least agree with the kinds of field studies that Brian just reported on, and where they don't. So kind of neat. It'd be curious to me as an educator to go back and see how people's perceptions changed based on the kind of data we've just heard about, or not. So very different kinds of studies looking at the same things. Next question is, were planted trees protected from deer browse? I'm curious to know if the species survival or lack of survival is due to local environmental condition or biotic impact.
Yeah, that's a good question. No, they weren't protected. You know, I think we had hopes that they would be, but just became logistically unfeasible. We do quantify obvious browse damage on our survival and growth surveys. And the one species that, not surprisingly, was really impacted was white cedar. And those were containerized, and a fair number of them were just kind of pulled up by the plug pulled out of the ground by the deer. There isn't any, Chris Looney, the grad student working on this, looked at sort of where we could tease out any obvious effects of recorded browse damage on survival, and it wasn't clear at all. So in just looking at it, it doesn't seem like it was a huge impact, but it was on the white cedar for sure.
Fairly predictable and interesting question here. What about unintended negative effects of the Manchurian ash? That is, could planting Manchurian ash create a new invasive species akin to buckthorn?
Yeah, I think it certainly could. The understanding we have with the Forest Service regional geneticist is that we're supposed to remove those individuals prior to them becoming reproductively mature. And we do know where they're all at. I mean, it's mapped on every study site and plot, so we can do that. You know, and so there's that. The broader part of this, in terms of sort of the philosophical aspect of that question, is that we're being faced potentially with a new reality in terms of what forests are going to look like, and the forests of us, let alone your fathers or grandfathers, aren't the forests that our children and grandchildren are going to experience. So I think we have to really kind of think hard about what's okay and what's not in the age of climate change and invasives. And I'm not saying that that Manchurian ash is the future, but it might be. If that's the only thing that survives there and is hydrologically functional and provides that basket making resource, it probably should be looked at pretty hard.
Number of good questions here. This is great. Brian, if you want to prognosticate a little bit, with large tracts of public lands that have black ash swamps that are hundreds or thousands of acres, planting would likely not be feasible across that whole area. Would you expect those stands to just turn into sedge wetlands?
Well, yeah, good question. I mean, many of you have seen this. They do that. So we have, particularly in the north, kind of the east central and northeastern parts of the state, this ongoing ash decline / dieback, whatever you want to call it, issue. And Rob Bennett and Mike Austria and I worked on that a number of years ago and got a sense of how widespread it is. And we saw some of the data from that in terms of what can happen in terms of tree regeneration. And it's not always this way, but oftentimes there isn't anything poised to replace that black ash. And when that happens, that they do become something else, alder thickets or sedge meadows. And it's not to say they won't become trees again eventually, but it's going to take a while successionally. So that is, I think, a potential direction these systems can face with EAB coming in. I just mentioned that, yeah, I know it isn't feasible to plant everywhere, but based on the work we've been doing, the Chippewa National Forest has undertaken a really large project to start transitioning their black ash wetlands to something else, and it does involve planting. I don't think it's planting Manchurian ash, but other species. So, you know, people are trying to do it. It's just, yeah, the scale we have, the 1 million acres, would be tough to do.
We received a question about whether EAB has advanced beyond Duluth in St. Louis County. I just replied, I guess maybe individually to that person. I'm not sure how this shows up. But there is an interactive map that the Minnesota Department of Ag publishes. And I am just about to, I just hit send on the chat pod, so that should now be available in the chat. Okay, next question. How many trees per acre were planted in the study?
It was actually a pretty low density. They weren't planted at replacement densities like whatever 600 trees per acre. We thought of them more as phytometers, so planted enough to have things to measure over time. But some of you have been out to the study site on a tour to see that. They're not planted to be numerically replacements like in the group selection or the clear cut. So it's on the low end. I don't know the exact number, but it's not at a planting density you would use in a silvicultural setting or a management setting.
Great. This might be another question for the community here if anyone wants to reply, but Brian, you may have some thoughts. How much preemptive planting or cutting is currently happening?
Yeah, so I don't know. I'd be curious about that too, really curious what people know. I just know from like the EAB meeting in Duluth this summer, a number of groups talked about what they're doing, and the one that I'm most familiar with is what the Fond du Lac Forestry Group, Natural Resource Group, is doing, and they've been under planting, and I don't know how many acres, but they've been pursuing it for a few years now. So I do know it's going on, and I would like to know how much more is going on statewide than that.
Good. So folks, if you know of organizations that are actively involved in that, send me an email or put it in the chat pod now or whatever makes sense, and we'll share that out. I want to just verbally draw attention to a comment Paul Dubuque added in response to the question about availability of potential replacement species. Silver maple, red maple, and cottonwood, all between 8 and 18 inches, give or take a little, are common hardwood seedlings available at the Minnesota DNR nursery on a regular basis. He included a link to the nursery website there. Folks can go looking for those, or again, you can look for that in the follow-up email for everyone who registered. Next question, would aerial seeding be a potential solution to establishing new species on large tracts of ash wetland?
Well, there's others in the audience, I would think, that know more about the potential for that as well. I think it certainly makes sense to me from a logistics standpoint if you can avoid having to tromp through those. I think they're probably difficult places to plant relative to other settings that people plant in. So I don't know any details about whether anyone's doing that or not, but seems like it would be something to look at.
Okay, we're getting down to the end here, Brian. We had another question. Is there any concern with balsam poplar being a shorter-lived species than black ash? Maybe it's not a perfect replacement, but maybe it's better than nothing. Any thoughts on that?
Well, that is sort of how we were thinking about it as well. Not a perfect replacement, but better than nothing. And the reason for that is it tends to be in those systems in some low abundance already. We know that it sprouts pretty readily after being cut. And then in our study, we had okay survival and really good growth for the surviving individuals. And so it just seems like in the short term, it's one that wouldn't take as much effort and finances to get in there. But the asker is right. It's not as long as live. You can see that black ash can potentially live a long time.
One more question about Manchurian ash, Brian, and I think this brings us to the end. So if I've missed any questions, maybe resubmit them for folks out there. And I guess I haven't asked about St. Paul. Let me know, folks locally here, if there's something you want me to pass along. Following up on Manchurian ash, has anyone evaluated, or Brian, are you aware of anything about whether Manchurian ash wood can in fact be used for basketry like black ash?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the one thing I'm aware of, a number of years ago, I'm forgetting the exact number, Gary Swanson organized a conference in Bemidji on EAB and black ash. And he's been really out ahead of the thinking on this for that forest for a number of years. And so he did that. And as part of that, he had some Native American basket makers there, including Mike Benedict, who's now at the BIA out west, but was with us here in our lab as part of the Forest Service for a number of years. And he did just a really limited amount of pounding on a Manchurian ash. May have been one log even, I don't know for sure, but it wasn't a lot. And I actually asked him about this via email not too long ago, and he said, yeah, you know, it looks like it could be okay. So it wasn't absolutely it's going to work. It may be something that should be looked at in more detail. So that's what I'm aware of. I wouldn't be surprised if other people have looked at it as well.
All right. I think that brings us to the end of the questions. Boy, that was a really great group of questions. I want to thank folks for sharing those. Oh, wait a minute. We've got a couple. Someone said, thanks for entertaining my large volume of questions today. Too much coffee. Hey, that's fine. One white spruce underplanting near Orr, Minnesota back in 2010. This is from DNR forestry person. Not directly related to preemptive EAB. Regeneration surveys of 1 and 5 years show poor bare root seedling survival in the ash stand. Overall stocking 30% at 120 white spruce per acre. Average height is 3 feet. All right, thanks for passing that along. And if folks have any others, oh, looks like we got a question here. Yeah.
I'm wondering about, will the planting strategy be to plant multiple species or go for more of a single species or just a couple?
Well, I can guess at the response there, Brian, and I'm sure it'll vary, but the question here from St. Paul is, will the planting strategy involve planting a number of different species, hoping that one or more will thrive, or will it be more kind of planting one species that maybe looks best suited? I'm sure that'll vary by different landowners and so on, but I wonder if you have a recommendation of one approach or any thoughts on that.
My response is I think we need to hedge our bets in a situation like that where there's something catastrophic facing a system like that or a species, and so I think more species within reason is probably better than trying to. So, for example, I would not advocate going out and planting swamp white oak at 800 seedlings per acre everywhere. I think we need to have a little more diversity in that. But, you know, it's a little tricky in that system because, as I pointed out, they were diverse systems, but not in terms of the dominance. We, of course, have lost American elm from that. Probably was more dominant than it is in the overstory. But, yeah, I think that having some diversity to it is going to be probably the way to go, given the uncertainty of not only EAB, but what climate change might do to those systems.
Okay, Brian, I realize we're a little over our time, so anyone who's online, obviously you can tune out anytime. Other folks here, don't hesitate if you need to move on. But I just noticed there were a couple of items in the chat pod that I didn't see that look kind of interesting. DNR Forestry has done some strip cutting in the Little Fork area with some initial good results of regen from other species. That comment came from Dave Schuler with Minnesota DNR Forestry. If anyone wants to follow up, you might contact him directly. Again, that's Dave Schuler, or feel free to drop me a line and I can help connect you. Okay, from Cloquet. Gee, Brian, I think this is exactly what you just addressed. Should we plant a mix of potential replacement species so that we increase stand diversity, or might this create new issues with a novel ecosystem? And I think you mostly just addressed it, but any last words on that?
Well, yeah, I think some diversity is probably better. The other part of that is, given what we're faced with this particular forest type, I think if we want to have forests in those wetland settings, it's going to be novel. If EAB mortality comes to pass as we think it might. So I don't know that we can avoid novel in that case.
Great. Yeah, well said. All right, Brian, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time and a very good talk. And thanks to all the folks online and here in St. Paul for a bunch of great questions. We appreciate it. As I said earlier, the presentation has been recorded. We'll get the recording posted to the SFEC website here in the next few days. And we will include in our email to registrants all of the Q&A and so on that was included here, at least the part that seems relevant. So thank you very much, folks, for tuning in, and thank you, Brian, for an excellent presentation. We appreciate it. Signing off.